And so I think it's useful to ask, when did slavery even first become morally problematic? And this is the first case study, if you will, that where I try to identify what are the most progressive pre-Christian attitudes towards slavery. And it's simply the case that Greek and Roman, Greek and Latin, moral philosophy, even the most progressive edges of it, like Stoicism, lack the moral resources to offer a political critique of slavery as an institution. And so, although there is a kind of narrative out there that Stoicism or Platonism, various ancient philosophies kind of paved the way for Christianity. In fact, Eric, if you look at particular social institutions like slavery, there's an utterly distinct break, that there's somehow a kind of leap of logic that occurs with the rise of Christianity to a public philosophy. And so, if you take the case of slavery, the Stoics never criticized slavery as an institution. And again, going back to something that Professor Rist said, which I think is a very important point, there's criticism about that's grounded in the moral health from the master's point of view, the moral well-being of the agent, but not of the victim of certain practices and institutions like slavery. And so you simply don't find that philosophies like Stoicism, which do say that all human beings are possessors of moral reason, but you don't see any criticism of slavery, the practice of slavery as an institution. That begins to change, I think, radically in the 4th century. And I would qualify this by saying that what you don't see arise in the 4th century is an abolitionist movement. A scholar of the period has written that the scriptural core of Christianity provided no articulate program of social reform and little impetus to change on the question of slavery. The command that slaves should obey their masters in the flesh with fear and trembling allowed Christianity to absorb the slave system with a minimum of inconvenience. And that scholar was me, so I can vouch that it's true. There's not a movement, there's not an abolitionist movement in late antiquity. It doesn't become broadly political or reformist, and certainly not in a constitutional sense. But it's nevertheless, I think, equally significant that for the first time in the 4th century, in fact, among a group of bishops in what's now Turkey, in Cappadocia, you find actual full-fledged criticisms of slavery as an institution. And in particular, I look at the social thought of an important Nicene bishop in the middle to late 4th century named Gregory of Nyssa, who's the first person to say that slavery is categorically wrong. And it's a remarkable document, a sermon. He's preaching on the book of Ecclesiastes, and just absolutely launches on an unexpected and unprecedented tirade that says all humans have dignity. And in particular says, think about the slave sale. How could you exchange money for the image of God? What has equal value? What has equal worth to the image of God? Human beings have moral reason, and you cannot put a price on moral reason. And it's an extraordinary argument. There's nothing like it in Stoicism, and for the first time you see this kind of logic that says human beings have dignity, and this has political, this has practical, this has institutional, this has social implications. And what a courageous kind of train of thought. It's almost like the Christian social gospel is a moral light switch. It's a flip. It's not a kind of gradual incremental improvement. It's a kind of argument, a kind of logic that was utterly unprecedented in the ancient world. Now, the great tragedy is that this has utterly no consequence in ancient Cappadocia, in ancient law. But nevertheless, for the first time, you see this kind of logic, and it's squarely grounded in the idea that all human beings are creatures in the image of God, and they therefore bear a kind of moral rationality that can be violated by particular social arrangements.